Hello, and welcome to this first in our three-part webcast series entitled Cloud Control, Reducing the Risk for Cloud Deployment, brought to you by Layer 7 Technologies and InfoWorld. I'm your host, Vanessa Boris. You know, we write a lot about SOA being a key to business agility, and with so much to offer in the way of cost savings and enhanced business practices, it has been widely embraced. And with SOA, we've learned that a governance practice is an absolute must for implementations to be successful. But what happens when you extend SOA into the cloud? Are there basic tenets of SOA governance that apply to cloud computing? What new challenges exist that you must address to deliver governance in the cloud? How can you maintain control over your cloud deployments? What about security? Well, we're going to dive right into this rich topic and help you understand what makes sense for your organization. Joining us for today's discussion are David Linthicum, author of Cloud Computing and SOA Governance Convergence in Your Enterprise. David is an internationally known cloud computing and service-oriented architecture expert. And also Scott Morrison, Vice President of Engineering and Chief Architect at Layer 7 Technologies. And we are going to start today's program with a question for you, our audience. The question is, do you currently have plans for a cloud implementation? And if so, when will you implement? And we've given you a number of choices here, ASAP, 3 months, 6 months, a year, greater than a year. We'd like you to select the radio button. This is an interactive radio button, and you can just select the one that best expresses where you are in your plans for a cloud implementation and submit your answer to us. And in just a few minutes, we will be looking at the results of the poll, and we can see where everybody in today's audience is on this really important topic. Okay, so we have some results in, and it looks like you do have plans for a cloud implementation. Some of you are moving forward as quickly as 3 months, and others more like a year away. I'm going to bring into our conversation today our special guest speaker, David Linthicum, to discuss our poll results. But I also, just before David comes in, I'd like to let you know that we're going to welcome your interaction with us and your questions throughout this program. Just type them into the box and hit Submit Question. David, what do these results mean to you?
Well, I tell you, Vanessa, it looks like that this is what I'm seeing in the market as well, that about a third of the people out there are looking to implement cloud computing this year, in the next 3 months, in fact. That's exciting news. And it looks like the remainder of the people, well, hold on, about 50% within the year, and about a larger portion of that within 3 months, and then greater than a year, the next 50%. So it's as we're seeing, it's a very exciting emerging area in the world of computing. People are looking to outsource a lot of their processing to the platform of the clouds, not everything, but portions of their processing, and that makes great economic sense. But governance, or the ability to put control and policies and management mechanisms and security around your movement into the cloud, from extending your systems out from the enterprise to cloud computing, is an absolute necessity in making that happen.
I would fully agree with that. And so audience, we're going to be checking in with you periodically through this program to ask you some more questions about where you are with implementing SOA governance in the cloud. But right now, we're going to give you some insight into what David's been finding in his own practice.
Well, cloud computing at its essence is nothing scary. So I think everybody has a tendency to see something that's very new in terms of cloud computing, and they think that it's something that's going to be a big paradigm shift and it's going to basically get at the core essence in how they do business. And that isn't the case at all. It really provides you with architectural options. In other words, other places other than on-premise systems that you can place processing services and information and manage those systems going forward. And then there's a lot of benefits of doing that, and the cost and the value of doing that is going to provide a lot to the bottom line within these organizations. So we do cloud computing for a couple of reasons. Number one, because it's an economic benefit. Through economies of scale, typically cloud computing resources are going to be a lot less expensive. It provides us with additional agility. I know agility has been a core tenet of service-oriented architecture. When you get into cloud computing, it really enhances your ability to be agile because you're able to move into new processes and new services. You're able to expand those processes and services as you need them using the elastic services of the cloud. And you're able to do so by scaling up and down costs as you need to scale up and down costs. So it provides you with a lot of flexibility in making that stuff happen. Finally, it provides you with some innovative ways in which to build systems quick and dirty and move into newer kind of innovative areas much more quickly and easily than we did in the past. So provisioning a cloud computing system may take hours. Say in Amazon systems or platform as a service systems such as Google Apps. So that's the reasons we're doing cloud today. Now, if you look at this slide, this is in essence the basic idea. So we're not looking to take our existing architecture and push everything outside the firewall to the platform, the clouds. What we're looking to do is to leverage certain aspects, our cloud services out there, that we're able to leverage within our existing service-oriented architecture. So things like Salesforce and Xignite and Google App Engine, all these things you're hearing about, the Amazon Web Services, the ability to incorporate those within our architecture and move pieces of our architecture out to the components of the cloud is really the core or the basic idea we're looking at today. So SOA and cloud computing are joined at the hip, as I wrote in the book. My book, SOA and Cloud Computing Convergence, ultimately is about the fact that if we're going to do SOA effectively, that cloud computing makes a great architectural option for a service-oriented architecture. So service-oriented architecture at its essence is an architecture. So it's basically the way in doing something. We're going to decompose our services and our information and our processes down to a functional primitive. We're going to rebuild them up again as something better than it was before. And we've been doing service-oriented architecture, at least informally, for 20 years, and formally for about 5 years. And we can understand that that's probably the better way to approach architecture, because ultimately, if we're addressing various systems as services, we're able to mix and match those services to form our applications, typically within putting volatility into a single domain, such as a process layer or a service abstraction layer or composite applications. Moving into that world, we now have the architectural option of cloud computing. Cloud computing is really nothing more than taking architectural components, which are very well known and understood by us, the storage components, service components, data components, process components, and then instead of running them on-premise, actually leasing those services for something outside the firewall, from Amazon, from Google, from Salesforce.com, the normal suspects out there. So it's really about providing us with an architectural component. So as you move forward in understanding this, know that service-oriented architecture is in essence the way in which we go about doing architecture. It's a way of improving and modernizing our existing information systems and adding new information systems to address the needs of the business much better. Cloud computing is really nothing more than an architectural option. In other words, it's a way of doing an architecture. It's an instance of an architecture. So, don't confuse the two. Some people say that cloud computing, some of the analysts out there I've heard say that cloud computing looks like a replacement to SOA, and actually nothing is further from the truth. The same patterns we use in service-oriented architecture we use when we leverage cloud computing. It's just basically a new platform. So understand the differences. So what I did was try to organize the cloud. And NIST just came out with a set of cloud computing definitions which were uncannily aligned with mine, so it was great to hear that. But I added a few. In other words, things that you can find out there are components of cloud computing you're able to leverage within your existing enterprise architecture or your service-oriented architecture, but they come in from outside the firewall or outside services. The core to this is infrastructure as a service. Infrastructure as a service are basically information data centers on demand, or data centers on demand. So Amazon EZ2, 3Tera, GoGrid, people that basically sell outsourced data centers are able to provide as a service. The beauty of that is it's complete control for you. You can use WebSphere, you can use other kind of application components, you can use different middleware layers, you can anything you want to use within the infrastructure as a service provider, because they typically provide things like Oracle databases, everything else out of the cloud. The other is storage as a service, basically disk space on demand, database as a service, which is database on demand, such as Oracle or SimpleDB, information as a service, such as providing stock quotes and risk analytics and other things out of a web service, and guys like Xignite and StrikeIron are all about doing that. Process as a service, application as a service, testing as a service, management as a service, platform as a service, basically providing a complete platform out of the cloud, storage, design, development, those sorts of things. And guys like Google App Engine and Salesforce.com are the big players there. Integration as a service, and ultimately security as a service. And all these things are basically starting to appear out onto the platform of the clouds. The beauty of this stuff is that you're able to make use of these components and mix and match to make them happen. The downside is, and why we're here in this webinar, is that if you're looking at all these existing services out there and leveraging these clouds within your enterprise, obviously you have a couple of concerns. Number one, you have to govern those things. You have to manage them, understand where they are, what they're doing, put policies around them, and put security parameters around them to make sure they don't misbehave, hurt some things within the existing enterprise architecture, or probably more often than not, something's going to change out there, and you need to be aware of the change and figure out how it's going to impact your existing architecture. So what I'm trying to make here is that cloud computing is multiple things and multiple kinds of patterns that exist out there in the services that are outside the firewall. And the success in cloud computing, especially considering the success of cloud computing with service-oriented architecture, is going to be your ability to govern those things. It's absolutely essential. If you don't have a core governance and a security plan, infrastructure, and core enabling technology that typically exists on-premise, you're going to fail in doing this. Just like everything in service-oriented architecture, more so in the governance, in the cloud computing world, if you don't have a good governance infrastructure, it's not going to work. You take anything out of this presentation, take that. So, however, not so fast. Not all computing resources should exist in the cloud. And one of the things that we are not seeing in this webinar is that everything within your firewall today is eventually going to live outside the platform of the cloud. That's not the case. We're going to exist in a hybrid world for a long period of time, where a small percentage of our existing services, processes, and data will reside on the platform of the clouds. And going forward, we're going to find other opportunities to outsource existing services, processes, and data to the platform of the cloud. And it's going to be a balancing act over time. So cloud computing is not always cost effective. You got to basically do your return on investment analysis to make sure that it is, and make sure that you understand exactly what kind of business benefits are going to be put into the cloud, and also that you do your homework before making the move. So you have to understand your own enterprise issues, the business drivers, the culture, where you're going, what's the vision of the architecture, what's the architectural strategy, what are your current data issues, what are the current inefficiencies that are affecting your IT infrastructure, how are you able to eliminate those inefficiencies. All those things need to be considered before you jump feet first into the world of clouds. So there are areas, however, that I found where cloud computing may be a fit, and also areas where they're not a fit, and obviously they're kind of mirror images of each other. Cloud computing is typically a fit when processes, applications, and data are largely independent. So in other words, if they're loosely coupled and they can basically exist and run for a certain period of time without being connected to another component, then the loosely coupled aspect of that makes it right for cloud computing. Because if you think about it, we're taking bits and pieces of our architecture and moving them outside to the platform of the cloud. And by doing that, loosely coupled architecture is the ability to basically abstract ourselves from changes being made out in the cloud environment or on-premise and having it kind of take the whole enterprise architecture down, or service-oriented architecture down like a house of cards. Needs to be a key protection. Governance is a key enabling technology into ensuring that that's going to occur. So you build for a loosely coupled architecture. You design for it. However, you ensure it happens in operational capacity using the technology around service-oriented architecture governance, like Layer 7, the ability to monitor services that exist inside the premise and outside the premise and make sure that they're working correctly and your holistic architecture continues to move forward. Next, when the points of integration are well-defined, you have service interfaces that are there, and we know how to move information in and out of the cloud systems onto the on-premise systems. When there's a lower level, security will work just fine. When now, it doesn't mean you give up security, but there's certain parameters of security where it's more of a better fit for a cloud than it is better fit for on-premise. And when the core internal enterprise architecture is healthy, you're not fixing your enterprise architecture by doing this. You have to have a healthy enterprise architecture to move out to cloud computing when the web is the desired platform. In other words, it's okay to leverage the web as a platform and the browser as a platform, because that's typically how cloud applications are externalized to users. When cost is an issue, in other words, you're trying to do something with a very limited budget. You're trying to be as effective as you possibly can. And when the applications are new, you're going to find that newer applications are much more easier to put on the platform of the cloud than existing legacy applications. So when it's not a fit, it's typically, like I said, the mirror image. When processes, applications, and data are largely coupled, when the points of integration are not well defined, when a high level of security is required, and when the core internal enterprise architecture needs work, when the application requires a native interface, and when cost is an issue. And in other words, costs is that you've ultimately, perhaps it's not cost effective to move to cloud computing, and therefore cost is an issue. So we have the same issue here on both sides. However, in some instances, we were able to make a business case where cloud computing is compelling. In other instances, the cloud computing is not compelling. In fact, in some instances, it's going to be more expensive. And when the applications are legacy, very difficult to take old systems that have been around for a long period of time and start pushing them out to the platform of the cloud. So the core message here is that not all applications and services and systems that exist within your enterprise are going to be right for cloud computing. You have to be selective in making sure you understand the architectural patterns of those systems and figure out which ones to outsource. Whatever you choose, you're typically going to end up with a hybrid architecture where pieces of your system are going to reside outside on the platform of the cloud, and that's where you're going to need a core, strong, very well planned, very well implemented, and very well designed governance system to make that work. Cloud control. Next slide. My guidance to you is to start with the architecture. So you got to understand your business drivers, you got to understand the information under management, the existing services under management, and the core business processes. And I describe these in the book in a great amount of detail because ultimately you're going to have to figure out what the business issues are, what the information you're dealing with, what processes you're dealing with, and what services you're dealing with first before we start figuring out which pieces and parts and architectural components should exist in the cloud. Systemic to this, and an underlying tenet of this, is the ability to kind of create a governance model around this. So as we start figuring out where we're going to, once we're defining our components and breaking the architecture down to its functional primitive and building it up again, typically going to be a hybrid cloud on-premise model, the ability to understand the services and the policies and the security parameters that need to be placed around those services is going to be a critical success factor to making that happen. My assertion is that's something you really can't do just as an afterthought. That should really be systemic to everything you do. You should understand exactly what your governance model is ultimately. When you get toward the end state, then make sure you pick the right enabling technology, governance technology, that's going to make it work effectively. You can't deploy governance as an afterthought. It has to be well thought out, well designed, and the technology you select to make governance work needs to fit the particular parameters you're looking to fit. Layer 7 provides the ability to provide that governance technology for you. So instead of you having to build those policy management and security management kind of parameters around that, you're basically able to buy that off the shelf, implement that within your enterprise to basically manage and monitor and work these various services that are going to exist on-premise, within the cloud, and all points in between. So this is kind of a high-level overview of implementing governance and what you need to do. So you need to basically move through the process and understand that you need to define the policies, you need to design the policies, you need to implement the policies. Process model, information model, and service model are really the inputs of doing this. So by the time we've gotten here, we have a process-level understanding, an information-level understanding, and a service-level understanding of our problem domain. We're creating the governance model by basically defining the policies, designing the policies, and then implementing the policies in a runtime governance environment. So during this phase, you basically take your existing architectural components, map it into a governance model, and then map that into a runtime governance tool, which is able to provide the control, the cloud control, between the enterprise architectural components, the on-premise systems, and the cloud-based services. If you follow this process to the letter and you basically do each one of these steps, you're going to be successful each and every time. If you miss any of these steps, and for example, you fail to implement in a runtime governance solution to design the policies effectively, then you're going to find it's going to be a very problematic architecture to operate in a runtime environment. Successful governance is about people and processes. So, make no mistake, technology is a core component of this, technology like Layer 7, but there's other more soft issues around that as well. So you have to understand the processes in place that the people need to do around checking the services into the governance systems and making the governance systems aware of those services, putting the policies around the services, and making sure that people are trained in the value of governance and how governance is absolutely critical to making a cloud, SOA using cloud-based system workable. And I've seen it time and time again. People that do not understand the value of governance or may not leverage governance are going to fail each and every time. In fact, the Burden Group study recently just kind of laid that out. People who work on the people and the processes and the technology, and you get kind of, the triad of success, are going to succeed each and every time. And that's because governance and security management is going to be a core tenet of making service-oriented architecture using cloud computing effective. And it doesn't change when you're using cloud computing. In fact, it becomes more important because of the number of widely distributed artifacts that are around, that you're managing, excuse me. So governance spans from on-premise to the cloud. So a runtime governance system will typically exist within the firewall. Okay, we'll be able to have a repository that knows where all the services are and what they're supposed to do and the policies that are around those services, able to log information, and is able to basically make sure that things are going well for this holistic distributed architecture. So if you think about it, what a service-oriented architecture is, and a service-oriented architecture using cloud computing is, the ability to place services, data, and processes everywhere. In this case, it's going to be on-premise in several different data centers within your firewall and perhaps off-premise in several different cloud computing offerings. And the ability to pull those together into a solution basically is the notion of architecture and creating the solution. But the ability to make that run, past minute one and operate that continually in a very complex distributed architecture is the value of governance. And you got to have the governance model. I know it sounds like a broken record, and you got to have the right governance technology, guys like Layer 7, to ultimately make this work. It is not there. It's not going to work, and I can't say that enough, having seen disaster after disaster. And so the pattern of success is people who understand governance are able to layer governance and leverage technology like Layer 7 into their problem domain. The pattern of failure are people who skip any notion of governance, people, processes, and technology. So application domain spanning on-premise and cloud. So, at the end of the day, we have the various service components out there and architectural components and the services that are bound to systems. We can basically define applications between them. So the cool thing about having a service-oriented architecture using cloud artifact is that the amount of applications you're able to create, such as composites or mashups or even bound processes, together are numerous. So you're able to basically weave any number of solutions out of the existing services and information that exists either on-premise or within the clouds. And that's the power of this architecture. And the cool thing about leveraging cloud computing is that if you need additional services or need additional application components to solve a problem, instead of you being on the hook to develop those things from scratch, you just go out and sign up with a particular cloud provider. And that is a beautiful thing. Ultimately, you're able to provide the ultimate flexibility in adding and deleting components, architectural components from your existing enterprise architecture to make that work. And that's the value of cloud computing. You just have to have the governance piece of it to make it work. So cloud computing won't be successful without governance. I can't stress that enough. So you got to have governance in order to make cloud computing work. You got to have it from an academic sense. In other words, the notions and the ideas behind it. People need to understand the value of it, including the developers and people who are leveraging the service-oriented architecture, leveraging cloud computing. And you got to have strong governance technology to make it work. Guys like Layer 7. Ultimately, that's the missing piece in making this whole thing work and play well together and making you successful with this technology. So if you follow everything that's in this presentation, including the content Scott's going to have, you're going to be successful with your governance solution around SOA using cloud computing each and every time. So with that, I have a poll question here before I turn it over to Scott. What is the single most important cloud security and governance issues for your company?
Yes, thank you so much, David. There's great food for thought so far, and we have a really complex poll question here. We're asking people to really zero in on their most important cloud security and governance issue. Would that be data privacy, access control, visibility as in how do I track and audit compliance, visibility as in how do I monitor and ensure SLAs and performance in the cloud, and all of the above. So that might be a choice that we see a number of people selecting. And this is a complex question. I'm going to give folks a minute to think about what their answer is to this, and also remind you that if you have questions for either David or Scott, whose presentation is coming up, please do just type them into the box and hit Submit Question. And also look for our email following this event. We're going to give you some information about 2 upcoming webcasts that are part of this series that you may want to attend. On June 11th, we have our next program called Making the Business Case and ROI for Cloud. So if this is making a lot of sense to you today and you're thinking about how do I talk this up my organization, then you'll want to tune in again on June 11th. So we're going to provide you with a registration link in the email that we'll be sending out tomorrow. And we have another program coming up in September, which is on best practices for providing security and governance in the cloud, sort of an extension of this very question that we're asking you to think about here. So a number of people have given us their responses, but I'm not quite ready to push the results out. I think what I do now is I'd like to welcome Scott Morrison, who's the Vice President of Engineering and Chief Architect at Layer 7 Technologies, into the conversation. Scott is leading a team to develop the next generation of security infrastructure for web services. As an architect and developer of highly scalable enterprise systems over 15 years, he has extensive experience across industry sectors as diverse as health, travel, and transportation and financial services. So I'm sure you're going to want to stay tuned and hear his presentation, and again, be thinking of questions for our guests, and type them into the box you see and hit Submit Question, and we'll be taking those shortly. So, Scott, as we'll welcome you back into the conversation here, here are the results of our second poll. We see one clear winner here, all of the above.
Well, listen, thank you, Vanessa. And hello, everybody. It's good to be on the webinar, especially with Dave, who I've respected for many, many years. Well, listen, this is a really, really interesting set of results here. And in some ways, it's almost a rhetorical question, which is, I think, what most people recognized early on here, is that all of these things are very important. Data privacy, access control, visibility in terms of both compliance and how you're focusing on actually meeting your compliance goals, and visibility in terms of understanding the usage of transactions and things in your system. All of these things are important. And this is a really important recognition that people have to make, because in the past, there's been a bit of a schism between security, between monitoring, and all of these components in the actual technology that's been rolled out into systems, whether it's in SOA or some of our earlier approaches to these things. What's important in SOA, what we learn from SOA and what we have to take outside into the cloud, is this whole idea that we need a holistic solution. We need something that actually offers all of these things. And that's, I think, what most of the people recognized in this actual poll that we pushed out. So listen, what I want to do now is take up from where Dave left off and actually talk about some of the technology. Now, Dave made a really excellent point, and I think it's the key takeaway here, is that governance is a very holistic process. It is about people and process and technology. And I can't help you too much with the people. That's fundamentally about, different personalities and how you manage them. But I can tell you a lot about the process and the technology. And it's the last piece, the actual technology, that I really want to focus on right now. Because that's actually what Layer 7's been a leader in the SOA space. And what we're starting to recognize is going to be an important thing in the cloud space as well, but with a few interesting modifications. So again, just to reiterate, you can't buy governance, but you can certainly buy tools that help you govern your applications, that help you govern your SOAs, and that help you govern your cloud deployments. So first of all, let me talk about, the three basic things, the three tenets, I think, that governance technology is about. And first of all, it's really about the enforcement of policy on services, okay? So we've got to actually take policies and distribute them out into all of our different services and provide a very, very finely grained view and security model around those services. Now, the thing about policy is it's actually a fairly complex topic, and I'll talk about it a little more in a few slides. But the key thing to recognize here is that policy fundamentally is that mechanism to secure and monitor all of your services, whether they're in your conventional SOA or, as we're going to see in a few minutes, out into the cloud itself. So that's part one. The second part of what governance technology is about is really about the life cycle management. So here's the thing, is that if you look at the assets that you start to create as you build a SOA, you'll recognize that there's a lot of pieces that you actually need to manage, okay? You've got things like WSDLs, the actual API descriptions, fundamentally that describe what is your policy or what do your services look like. Of course, you've got policies, which again I'm going to talk about in a moment, which really describe security, monitoring, governance around, exactly each one of those services. You might potentially have orchestration rules in that, commentary, history about, the evolution of your different services and your distributed applications, what dependencies they have. Those are all the kind of assets that somehow you need to manage effectively in any kind of large SOA deployment. And when you think about it, there's a lot of functions that you need to apply to those things. You need to be able to version them so that if you make a mistake or something, or you need to roll back for one reason or another to a previous instance of any one of these assets, WSDLs, policy, orchestration rules, whatever, you need to be able to do that very quickly and rapidly. You need some mechanism for doing staging, because let's face it, we all start developing applications in some kind of test lab, and then we move them out into a development lab. We then move them out into some kind of test lab. We maybe go to a pre-production environment and finally migrate them out to production. There's a real process behind that. And understanding and articulating that process, that's very much part of what governance is about. And so we need tools that actually help us stage that kind of thing, tools that help us take these assets, policies, WSDLs, everything like that, and move them effectively through that process, doing things like mapping changes between the environments. A good example might be IP addresses. If you actually have IP addresses within your policies somewhere, obviously as you go from a test environment to a production environment, those are going to change. How do you do that effectively in a very deterministic manner so that you can reproduce it every single time and that you don't accidentally, miss an octet or something like that in an IP address and end up, bringing a whole application down? You need backup and restore. You need ways of managing these assets in such a way that if you've got a problem, if you need to have some kind of disaster recovery, you can actually do it. And ideally, you need some kind of access control around these assets, like some kind of role-based access control where different identities, different roles, different people, different identities can actually get access to different parts of the policy, different parts of the WSDL, so that you can, across a whole SOA, across a whole environment, across clouds, start to segment out those kinds of responsibilities. So the security officer is allowed to actually access the security policies. The operations officer can actually go in and change the operational monitoring characteristics of each different service. So when you think about it, you start to see something that looks kind of familiar. And anybody who's done any large-scale software development starts to see these kinds of patterns. Really, good governance is something that's done in, good software development. I mean, whenever we do any kind of major, team-based software development, we use tools to help us out. We have things like repositories, like Subversion or CVS or something like that, to do versioning, tracking. It has role-based access control, like I was describing earlier, to actually manage those assets. And those assets are things like, code and, properties files and all of the things that go into actually making an application. We have maybe build machines and what processes around that. I know certainly in my team that I run here, we've got certain people that are really the ones who are designated as having the role for doing actual builds, and they use very specific tools and systems to do that kind of thing. In other words, we've systematized it. It's about the people. It's about the processes, but fundamentally there are tools supporting that as well. We have image management issues. Whenever we create a gold image or, let's say, an alpha image or a beta image, we need ways of managing those kinds of things. Again, it's a combination of tools, but also the process and the people behind it. The tools can't replace the process, but they can certainly help you out with it. They can augment it, and they can ensure that you do it in a very deterministic manner. And really doing things the same way in a very orderly manner is the soul, fundamentally, of what good governance is about. Now, finally, the last part of what governance technology is really about is comprehensive monitoring. So you can't just have enforcement. You've also fundamentally got to have monitoring of every one of those services. So you've got access to dashboards. So, at any instant you can tell how many transactions per second are going into your get stock quote application. You need something like reports so that you can do retrospective understanding of what your most popular services are. What's been up, what's been down. Audits and things like that are a very important thing to be able to manage. You need to set alarms against certain events and make sure that the right people are notified when something happens that might, require some kind of corrective action or something like that. So all of this stuff together makes up a whole major component of monitoring, which is really fundamentally an important part of what governance is about. So again, to reiterate, it's about enforcement of policies, about the management, the life cycle management of these assets, and finally monitoring and audit comprehensively across a service-oriented architecture, a service-oriented network, a grouping of applications that might span not just your on-premises network, but potentially move out into clouds as well. So the important thing to remember, and the important point to take away from this, is that it's still about people and process. The tools are there to help you out, and tools are essential pieces to actually enforce the processes and help out the people. And a good example is, we see it every day, our police government, okay? Well, I hope not, because if anybody's on here and they would say yes, fundamentally that's probably means you're living in a police state, which is an unfortunate situation. Police aren't government, but they're certainly an instrument of governance itself. I mean, the police are there to, enforce the rules. They're there to enforce law and really create order. And fundamentally, that's what governance is about. The tools are there to enforce the laws. The tools are there to enforce the policies. And out of that, we actually create, some kind of order. So I was talking earlier about policy. Well, policy is the law. Policy are the laws of the land. It's really the set of rules that need to be enforced on a day-to-day basis in any running system. Because it doesn't matter how much you trust all of your employees and things like, and trading partners, et cetera, you fundamentally need, on a continuous basis, to be applying the rules all the time. And policy then is really applied to any exchange of information between systems, whether it's a client or a server or two peers, two systems that are actually exchanging, let's say, XML documents or any kind of information. Policy is what you apply to that actual exchange of information. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of like a border crossing when you think about it. Policy is really about the steps that you take and the steps that the government or the border guard takes to actually decide whether or not somebody's going to get into, let's say a country. Think about it. Whenever you cross a border, let's say at the airport or something like that, you have to pull out your passport and identify who you are. In other words, you're authenticated. There's a trust relationship there between countries. I live up in Canada, and when I go to the States, there's an implicit trust relationship between Canada and the U.S. so that my passport, my Canadian passport, is accepted down there. But nevertheless, I'm authorized. In other words, I'm checked out to make sure that I'm not on any, list of people who aren't allowed into the country or anything like that. I'm checked for things like contraband and that to make sure I'm not bringing in anything illegal, which of course I'm not. But that's part of the process. In other words, it's part of the steps that's applied to absolutely everybody going through that process. So what you're seeing is a script, in effect. So border guards are following a script, a series of laws, a series of steps that enact policy. And that's exactly what Layer 7 does, is that it creates scripts, literally a language, a scripting language, that actually applies the kind of policy that you need in any exchange of information between senders and receivers of information, between a client and a server, between two peers in a network, between your SOA network and your cloud applications as well. So the next thing to ask is then, how is policy actually applied? So if I've got this grand idea of policy being a series of laws and things like that, how do I actually apply it on a day-to-day basis? Well, that's what we do. What we've done at Layer 7 over the last 7 years is build policy enforcement points. We actually have a technology here that we call a secure span solution. And in the early days, it started out as a fairly simple idea. an XML firewall, an access control box that you just put into your network that guards applications in a service-oriented network. Now, over time, of course, it fundamentally started to grow into a much, much more sophisticated vision about an application point of policy, where what it does is it essentially intercepts a stream of communications between two systems. It identifies that. It says, this is a message for the stock quote service, and then retrieves a policy specifically for that service and applies that policy. It executes that policy. And of course, every different service could have a very different policy. Again, think about, let's say, a stock trading application made up of two different services, get stock quote and buy stock. Well, get stock quote has a very simple policy. Let everything through. You don't need to know who's asking for it. You don't need any confidentiality on it. I mean, it's the same information you can get for free off of, let's say, Yahoo Finance or something like that. But in contrast, the get stock quote service, the buy stock service, very different. All of a sudden, you need to know who's sending the message. You need to have some kind of confidentiality. You certainly need integrity because you don't want a man in the middle, flipping your, buy 100 shares of layer 7 into, sell 100 shares of layer 7. So all of a sudden, you need a much more finely grained level of security and a much more finely grained level of monitoring on that transaction. And that's what policy gives you. Policy gives you the ability to express those kinds of rules and enforce those kinds of rules on any exchange of information between systems. And that's what we do here at Layer 7. We actually build the fastest and most flexible systems for doing exactly this kind of policy enforcement. We have fully clusterable systems so they can actually share information between each other. So in other words, you can't, if you get refused by one, you can't deke around and try to get in through another. We also share policies between systems. So there's absolute continuity. And really, the soul of good security, the soul of good governance is actually doing things the same way. It's continuity. It's consistency. It has to be applied the same way throughout your network. Of course, it can be tuned on a service-by-service basis, but it has to be done in exactly the same way at all points. And that's a very important thing. So Layer 7 really is the best of breed for building these kinds of SOA gateways, XML transform systems. If you're the kind of company that needs anything like XML firewalling, XML transformation, defeat against the kinds of XML attacks that are starting to float around on the Internet, any kind of security processing of XML, monitoring of exchange of information between any SOA entities, you should be talking to us because this is exactly what we've been doing for about 7 years. So the next question, though, is in the SOA world, where we've done a lot of this kind of work over a number of years, can we take the same kinds of ideas and move that out into the cloud? And the answer is absolutely. And in fact, you have to. Here's the problem with the current approach to management, security, and monitoring the cloud. It's just too coarse. If you look at a lot of the solutions that are out there right now, they're all about managing virtual machines. They're all about simple access control like username and password and simple transport control like SSL. And these are okay, and they're in fact important components, but they're not enough. We have to go back to a very important idea that came out of SOA, which is really that we have to focus at a very granular level on the service itself. Again, use my previous example, the example of a stock trading application. The actual services that make up that application are not created equal. Each needs a different kind of policy to it. So the important thing that we learned from SOA is that, it's about the services, stupid. You got to go back to that all the time. We need that fine-grained control. We need that fine-grained governance over every individual service. It's not good enough just to aggregate an application and an OS and create a virtual image together and manage that and think you got it all. You have to delve down and dig into the services themselves and work on each one of those. And that's what's going to happen into the cloud. Because the thing about cloud computing is that cloud computing will be done as services. It's just fundamentally a good idea. We're not going away from SOA. We're not turning our back on SOA. We're building on SOA. And as Dave said earlier, we're recognizing that cloud is just a new deployment mechanism for SOA. And so we should be taking these people, processes, technology that SOA has given us that have been developed under the sort of crucible of the last 7 years of application development and actually move that, again, out into the cloud. And the best way to show that, the best way to give you a sense of that, is actually to walk through a couple of use cases. And that's exactly what I'll do. So what I'll do is look at three very simple use cases that I think characterize the kind of use of the cloud that people are going to do. And here's the thing to remember as you go through this. Cloud will happen. It is inevitable. I mean, the thing about cloud that excites me and a lot of other people around here is that it just fundamentally changes how we're going to deploy applications and makes it easier. It really is about those two things that Dave pointed out, that sort of 1-2 punch of agility plus an absolutely bulletproof economic argument, that movement from a CapEx-dominated budget to budgets that are much more focused on the idea of simple, small, recurring operational expenses. I mean, every CFO, every CEO, once they really understand that, is going to push you as a CIO, a CTO, or an application developer. They're going to push you into cloud. You may want to go there. You may be actually already going there, but here's the reality. The business is going to make this happen. And so what's important for us is to recognize how cloud will be used and recognize how the good infrastructure that we've developed around SOA and that we can use right now today in our SOAs can actually be used again to support exactly the kind of cloud deployments that we're going to see all the time. So here are the three things I'm going to talk about quickly. The first scenario is how to manage staff members' utilization of those applications. Because let's face it, cloud's pretty exciting and we're all going to make use of that. Next, I'll talk about how cloud applications can need access to internal data. That actually is something that's happening more and more as we go along. And finally, managing and monitoring of new applications in the cloud. Let's look at the first one. So here's a quick straw poll, and we don't actually have this on the system because it's sort of a rhetorical question. Who here has a credit card in a browser? Okay, let's face it, it's going to be 100%. Everybody has a credit card in a browser, which means before this webinar actually finishes in a few minutes, you could be out in the cloud. 5 minutes with a credit card in a browser, and you can actually be deploying applications out into the cloud. But this is a problem. And it's a problem simply because how do you control that? From a big picture point of view of sort of corporate governance, how do you ensure that all of those people who are out there deploying cloud applications are actually doing it in a way that's consistent with what you want and how you want to run your corporation? The solution really is to actually look again to SOA technologies, look again to the kind of applications that we build here at Layer 7, secure span gateways, which are really engines for applying policy. They're policy enforcement points, and applying policy to every one of those outgoing transactions. And this way, you can actually get control and visibility and manage access to the kinds of applications that people are going to be going out there and using all the time. And so the important thing to recognize here is that there's nothing new here. This is actually starting to leverage existing technology, but leveraging it so it gives you control over the cloud. Here's another problem that people are starting to see more and more as they go along. Cloud services, things like, let's say, Salesforce.com or any of these large SaaS applications, software as a service, are starting to create APIs so they can actually literally access information that already exists within your corporation. Here's a good example. You might have customer data that actually resides in a mainframe, and we know that's not going to move out into the cloud in the next little while. It's going to be on that mainframe because there's tremendous value in that. Cloud isn't about throwing out things. So is not about throwing out things. It's actually about integration. It's actually about using that. But how can you govern those kinds of interactions? How can you let a Salesforce.com use its API that it's defined to go in there and get access into your mainframe application? Well, not surprisingly, the answer once again is to start to apply these kinds of secure span gateways in a DMZ environment where they can apply policies to those kinds of transactions. So in other words, they can ensure the right kind of security policies are being enforced so that, let's say, there's transport layer security or maybe certain critical elements in any transaction are properly encrypted, that there's integrity across that. They make sure that the only access to those systems is actually coming from the authorized SaaS application and not from some bad hacker halfway around the world sitting in their basement. And they can also enforce SLAs, set off alarms when there's problems going on, and actually basically audit everything in there so that you have a real understanding both of the operational characteristics in any instance of your applications, your internal SOA, but also make sure that retrospectively you can do forensic auditing and get a sense of how often things are being used, what happened if some kind of problem occurs and that, so you can trace back there. That's exactly what these kinds of devices do, and this is exactly the scenario that we at Layer 7 are seeing more and more with our customers. Now, finally, I think the most interesting one is where the technology actually changes somewhat to actually incorporate new technologies in the cloud. So here's what's going to happen, and here I think Dave actually led us right into this really well, which is the observation that cloud applications sometimes will be very monolithic, but very, very quickly they're going to be extremely distributed. So a cloud application isn't just going to be out in the cloud, but it will actually be composed of services in the cloud plus services in, a regular on-premise compute facility and services, well, maybe even somewhere else with a business partner or something like that. In other words, applications are aggregating all of these pieces together and you need some way of governing that. You need some way of managing the security for that, managing the visibility into that, and giving yourself the control and the trust and the confidence that you have a big picture view and a big picture governance strategy over all of those different components. The way to do that is actually with, again, a new kind of vision of traditional technologies, which is the virtual appliance. Here at Layer 7, in the past, what we've done is we've sold hardware appliances, classic 1U boxes that plug into your network, and they're extremely high performance, and they've got purpose-built silicone to do things like delve into XML messages, transform those, validate them, et cetera, et cetera. What we've done is we've created a virtualized instance of exactly the same thing that can be moved, well, anywhere in the cloud. It can be bound to applications, follow applications throughout the cloud, and literally protect those applications on a service-by-service basis. You can take policies that you've written in one of the hardware devices and move it over into one of the virtual devices with absolutely no issues whatsoever. They are functionally equivalent. The difference is the virtual instance, of course, can be moved anywhere. It can be out in the cloud. It can be within your existing environment, but it can be managed in exactly the same way. And this is the exciting kind of area in the whole cloud space right now, because now you're actually starting to see the whole evolution of this whole idea of virtualized appliance. In other words, the core infrastructure that we're using to run our networks, the core infrastructure that has been proven in existing SOAs on premises, is being replicated in a virtualized instance out into the cloud. So your model isn't changing. You're still doing SOA. You're still doing secure SOA. You're still doing monitored SOA. The difference is now it's out into the cloud. So we have a final poll question. And of these three scenarios, which one's going to matter the most to you? So with that, I'll turn it over to Vanessa.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. And indeed, audience, we have another poll question for you. Which of the cloud governance use cases matter most to you? Would that be managing staff members' utilization of cloud applications, managing cloud applications that need access to internal data and services, or managing and monitoring applications in the cloud? And we're going to leave this up for a minute and get your insights to this. I'd like to remind you also that it's not too late to send us your question. We've reached the point of the webcast where we're going to entertain as many questions as we can from the audience. And, of course, we're not terribly surprised, but this webcast with these wonderfully rich in information presentations have stimulated quite a few questions. So what I'd like to suggest is that, Scott, while we're giving folks a chance to answer our last poll, might I start with a question from the audience?
Sure, that'd be great.
Yeah. So we have a viewer who's written in, I can't trust Amazon to protect my data, control who has access to my data, or guarantee my SLAs. How will these virtual policy enforcement points help me maintain control over my data and applications that I put into the cloud?
Well, it's an excellent question, actually. And that's exactly where the idea of a virtual appliance can actually help you out, because it's giving you very, very fine-grained control into every one of your services, which you control. So in other words, you're building that policy and which governs access to any one of those different services that you build. Now, Amazon, of course, being, like any kind of third-party provider that's giving you services, will always have internal staff who can get into anything. They will always have, in effect, the super user account. So the important thing then is to recognize that what you can do with finely grained services is you can start to segment out your data and decide that, okay, I've got a one large database with a bunch of tables in it. One of these tables is absolutely critical, and for compliance reasons, I absolutely cannot move this out of my own environment. And so I can leave that in my environment, move the other data that for compliance reasons you can start to move, put out into the cloud, put that out, say, with Amazon or something, and then use devices like the virtual appliance, the secure span virtual appliance, to actually put very, very fine-grained control over those services. So in other words, what you're doing is you're segmenting out your data in ways that actually allow you to make decisions about where it has to reside, and then enforcing the best possible security you can get to actually gain confidence that the right people are seeing it at the right time. And that's the key to policy. Policy is really just a mechanism. It's a way of articulating exactly what your rules are going to be and enforcing those rules and monitoring those rules at all times.
David, I'd like to invite you back into our conversation.
I'm here.
It's been a while since we heard from you, and we have a couple of questions that I think make sense for us to ask you. And the first is how the traditional IT organization has to change in order to support cloud computing.
Well, I think ultimately they have to accept that it's okay to do it. I think it's very polarizing right now. So you go into some organizations, they're just so gung-ho cloud computing, they're just trying to push everything outside the firewall, whether it needs to be pushed or not, or whether or not there's a business case to make it happen. And then on the other side, there's people I call the arms folded crowd that view it as something that's going to top their security. It's going to cause control issues, and then they push back on it. One of the things I would do is basically educate people that we're not making any kind of rash moves that are going to scuttle the existing enterprise. We're looking at this as an option to save some money, analogous to outsourcing. There's some things that should be outsourced to other countries and some things that shouldn't, and the same thing with cloud computing. So at the end of the day, it's people getting comfortable with the notion that it's okay to make that happen and getting comfortable with the control issues that are around putting things out in the cloud. And it's going to basically take a bit of a cultural change.
A lot of sense. Well, to both of you, we have the results now we'd like to take a look at for our third poll to the audience, trying to understand what cloud governance use cases matter most to the audience. And Scott, you want to give us your reactions to that?
Oh, this is interesting. The middle one, managing access into into things like legacy applications and existing data. I really agree with that. Because I think here's the interesting thing. We didn't make that up. That was first brought to us by our customers who were actually using our existing, secure span gateways. In their case, they were actually using physical, appliances, hardware appliances. And they came to us with a very specific use case, which was literally the Salesforce one, where Salesforce needed access to existing legacy data. Because, Salesforce is brilliant. We use it here. I'm a big advocate of it as a great cloud app. But, there's some data that you're just never going to push out there and that you're going to always control. And you need very, very finely grained control into that. And so the irony was, this was almost a problem that our customers found and came to us for and said, can we use your technology to do this? And we recognized that, well, absolutely. That's a perfect use case. And so you don't need to change anything. Literally, the equipment that they had right there that they were using to govern their SOA was also exactly what they needed to effectively govern access from a cloud app. So this is an exciting thing to see.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So I think, David, do you have any additional comments, or should we go to our next?
No, it doesn't surprise me. That's the way most people. That's the way I would have thought the poll would have come out.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so another question directed to you, Scott. Am I in danger of getting stuck in the cloud once I move my applications to Amazon?
That's an excellent question. You know what? You have to look at that on a case-by-case basis because part of what we want out of the cloud is agility, but we also don't want to be tied to the cloud, and we don't want to be locked in. Now, of course, vendors will always want to lock you in one way or the other. But it's kind of like, your cell phone. And in the beginning, we got locked to, numbers with particular cell phone providers, and everybody threw up their arms. And it took a long time to get that freedom so that we could move our cell phone numbers between, wireless providers and things like that. We need the same thing in the cloud, because you shouldn't be tied to, one cloud provider or another. Because let me tell you, there are going to be huge pricing battles and capability battles and everything like that, simply because cloud makes a lot of sense, and a lot of companies are going to flood in to meet the whole environment for being, providers. And each one of them is going to have different characteristics. Some will specialize in lowest price. Some will specialize in best security. Some will specialize in, best possible disaster recovery and have sites on different continents and things like that, and instant, transparent, transfer between them. The important thing, though, is to recognize what's tying you in. And there is a danger, especially with some of the platform as a service offerings, which we're finding more and more have great benefits, but also lock you in. They're using APIs that are extremely proprietary. They may take languages like Python and things like that and add great new functions, but you won't see those functions anywhere else, which means you're effectively locked in. You have to be careful about that, and you have to look at these things and make that an important part of your whole governance process and cloud discovery process, is understand what your tolerance for lock-in is and what the capabilities are of your vendors, and constantly revisit that. An important part of governance is it never ends.
That's right. I know we've heard from customers over and over again, and our readers of InfoWorld. So we just have time for a very short addendum to our Q&A. David, I'd like to ask you, what's the difference between private and public clouds? And when should I choose one over the other when I consider moving my applications?
Sure, it's a great question. I mean, private clouds are in essence virtualized environments within the firewall that you can basically have self-provisioning, and they're able to allocate lots of different processes and users over a span of hardware. So in essence, it's taking what cloud computing does, is allowing lots of different people to share the single set of hardware platforms in kind of a multi-tenant environment, but using it into a virtualized environment, which is yours. In other words, locked down in your data center, you control it. So public clouds are typically provided as a service to users they may know or not know. So anybody can go up and allocate any kind of storage as a service space, database as a service space, whatever. And within the private cloud environment, they need to know who you are. You're typically part of the company, and you're going to allocate those systems. They're going to provision you. But at that point, the patterns are basically the same. It's a matter of sharing things. In virtualized private cloud environments, still need governance. Everything's applicable. Everything we just talked about in terms of governance around cloud computing to on-premise still exists in private cloud infrastructures. You're just using an infrastructure that has a tenant that's behind the firewall, but the governance and the security stuff still prevail. The advantages of private clouds, a lot of people, as we mentioned earlier, like to control their systems, and so they think private clouds, they want to use the value of cloud computing from a cost-saving standpoint, but won't trust Amazon with their data, so they keep it inside, and that's perfectly fine. What that doesn't eliminate is the need for governance and security. In fact, that increases it, because you have to deal with kind of a hybrid architecture, because typically people who use private clouds, as I'm finding, also use public clouds. So they have different layers. They have the traditional enterprise architecture in SOA, and they have the private cloud infrastructure. You're typically running VMware or Xen. And then they extend that out to the public clouds, typically Amazon, and they have to manage all those layers and basically govern all those things. So governance becomes even more important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And our last question of the day, this could really be a long answer, but I'm going to ask Scott for his short answer to, will cloud replace SOA?
Well, actually, I think Dave made an excellent point on that one, which is really cloud ultimately is a deployment model for SOA. So we're not turning our back on SOA at all. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth, which I think is exactly the word that Dave used as well. SOA taught us a lot of good things. SOA taught us sort of some fundamental truths about building, large distributed applications and that, and we'd be crazy to turn our back on that. Instead, what we want to recognize is that cloud is an opportunity for SOA, and in fact, it's a great opportunity for SOA.
Indeed. Well, that's all the time that we have in our program today. I'd really like to thank my guests, David Linthicum and Scott Morrison. If you enjoyed today's presentation, please look for our email that will give you a chance to review the presentation as we presented it today and to register for the next 2 webcasts in our series. Coming up on June 11th, we have Making the Business Case and ROI for the Cloud. And in September, join us for Best Practices for Providing Security and Governance in the Cloud. So do look for our email. And before we go, also, I'd like to encourage you to take a look at the resources section of the webcast player. You're going to find a number of things there, including an excellent white paper, Steer Safely into the Clouds. So for today, on behalf of Layer 7 and InfoWorld, thank you so much for joining us.